So, Father, guide us as we reflect on those words this morning. For Jesus Christ's sake, Amen. This is a slightly strange Sunday. It's the beginning of the season of carol services. And we're still in Advent, both at the same time. When we look back to Jesus coming in great humility, and we look forward to him coming in his glorious majesty. We're about to celebrate Christmas, and we've been busy here in church retelling the Christmas story with schools and the Christmas experience in church, and lots of children here. But at the same time, we're looking beyond the next couple of weeks, 3 weeks, to things on a much bigger time scale. And at the same time, and maybe in our minds, it's all a bit mixed up together. It's perhaps surprising to us that there is so little about what we call Christmas in the New Testament. Some things in Matthew's Gospel, nothing in Mark's Gospel, the most in Luke, and an alternative way of looking at it all in John. As we come closer to holiday time, it's holiday for some of us at least. Our builders on our building project will come to our holiday for about 2 weeks, and it'll suddenly be still and quiet every day. So as we come closer to holiday time, school term finishing, families travelling and gathering, see if you can make time to reread the opening chapters of the Gospels. Don't try and read the whole lot, the whole of all 4 Gospels. Just start with the opening chapter or chapters. See what they actually say and don't say. Imagine how it would be if you were one of the first group of Christians who had had the opportunity of hearing one of those 4 books about Jesus read aloud in your church gathering. And you might well have heard just one version of the story, not the New Testament as a whole, let alone what we call the Bible. Luke's Gospel has the most to say about what we're celebrating. And it's helpful to read the headings in the version we read from this morning. This is how the headings go. The birth of John the Baptist foretold. The birth of Jesus foretold. Mary with Elizabeth. Mary's song. The birth of John the Baptist. Zechariah's song. The birth of Jesus. Shepherds and angels. Jesus presented in the temple. The boy Jesus in the temple. John the Baptist prepares the way. The baptism and genealogy of Jesus. That's all the headings. It's a whistle-stop tour, that is, just reading the headings of 3 chapters of Luke's Gospel. Now, of course, the headings are not part, well, perhaps you don't realise that the headings are not actually part of the Gospel that Luke wrote down. They've been put in a sense, editorial. The editor's been at work to put in whoever published, translated the Bible and then published it. The editor has put in headings to help us see the wood for the trees. They were added centuries later to help us grasp the overall framework, see the whole picture. So Luke, even though he didn't give us those headings himself, it's quite clear from the way his gospel starts that he intended to give us a clear presentation. He wanted to take us from Jesus' birth being promised to Jesus at his baptism being poised on the edge of beginning his public ministry, aged 30. Is there anything missing out of those headings from the way Luke tells his story? Anything that we think of as part of Christmas that was missing as I read those headings? Alan? The wise men. If you had just Luke's gospel, you'd know nothing about the wise men. And I think that's about it, but you can challenge me afterwards and say I've got it wrong. So there's a lot of the story there, and that's why if we want to recommend people reading a gospel, Luke's a very good place to start, because at least you've got the familiar things there. Otherwise, somebody reading it for the first time, if they've picked odd bits and pieces up from school nativity plays, they might wonder, is this the book that our nativity story has been based on? But Luke is the fullest account. And also another good reason for reading Luke, it isn't to do immediately with Christmas, is that it has lots of human stories in it. One of the courses alongside Alpha, one of the other courses called Emmaus, another discovery course, actually based it on Luke's gospel because it was straightforward to read. It had lots of interactions between people and Jesus. There is much too that Luke tells us that the other gospels don't mention at all. If you have time, if you can make time over the next 2 weeks or so, and particularly after Christmas, if you can make time just to reread those opening chapters again, you'll see what I mean. And I think we owe it to ourselves, if we're serious about being Christians today, to go back and see what the New Testament actually says. Reread what's there. So we've jumped in our reading today, just like that. We've jumped 30 years from Jesus' birth to John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus to begin his public ministry. He challenges, he's a bit rude to people, calling them a brood of vipers and saying, who told you to come here and be baptized? Almost as if he was going to put them off. Who told you to flee from the wrath to come and think you could get it all right by being baptized? He's calling people to be baptized, to have their lives washed clean, a fresh start, a turning back to God, ready for the Messiah, the King, coming. And if they accepted this call, they needed to be sincere about it, not just doing it out of self-protection, just in case. They needed to live lives that showed they truly were repentant, to show that they really wanted a fresh new start, to look to the Messiah, the true King coming, and not simply seeing their ancestral roots as a guarantee of their acceptance by God, looking all the way back to Abraham as the father of the nation, because that was the other thing they were tempted to do. John the Baptist was radical in his challenge, a separate, practical challenge for ordinary members of the crowd. A particular challenge to the tax collectors who used to collect the taxes and then slip a bit into their own pocket. A particular challenge to soldiers not to abuse their powers and misuse force for their own benefit. And no doubt he could have given many other practical challenges to different people he might have singled out as he looked at the crowd in front of him. Getting ready for the Messiah had practical consequences. Now, the interesting thing is, in the Bible I've read this reading from, it comes to the bottom of the page and a full stop. And it wasn't until I read something else that I actually bothered to turn over the page and see what came next. This is roughly what comes next, where we read the consequences for John the Baptist. When John the Baptizer rebuked Herod because of Herodias, his brother's wife, and all the other evil things he had done, Herod added this to them all. He locked up John in prison. No, I might never have noticed that if I hadn't turned the page. So it's worth doing that. If you've got a Bible and it seems to come to the end, just see what comes next. Because it just by the nature of publishing and only having so much printed text on a page, sometimes the way pages turn can mean that we miss something out that's really important that comes next. John the Baptist was challenging the crowd. He was challenging the tax collectors. He was challenging the soldiers. And as we read in the next two verses that weren't included in Andrew's reading, he was challenging Herod, the ruler of Galilee. And John ultimately lost his life. He pointed to Jesus as the genuine King of the Jews, and effectively said that Herod was an impostor, a sham, because of the way he behaved. But he had to, in doing that, confront the claims of the existing king, a very uncomfortable thing to do. When Paul told the Philippians to rejoice in the Lord, he was writing to a Roman colony in Philippi. And the word Lord meant, to most people's ears, Caesar, the emperor. And celebration was what happened on Caesar's birthday and other similar imperial festivals. That puts a whole different complexion. So rejoice in the Lord actually could be heard in a quite different way. It could be heard in the context of that Roman colony and how they had to react and behave with the emperor. So-called peace in Roman colonies was maintained by heavy-handed and often brutal rule. In contrast, Paul talks about the peace of God, which passes all understanding. Paul's deep, deep belief was that God's peace would one day rule in the world. And that gave him courage. That conviction, deep conviction, gave him the courage on different occasions to challenge the rulers of the day. Ultimately, Jesus was the true King of all the world. So today, as we are on the verge of our Christmas celebrations, we're not just thinking of a Christmas baby laid in an animal's feeding trough, a manger. We're thinking about so much more if we allow our minds to go there, if we allow them to almost be blown apart with the kind of convictions that people like Paul had that are written deep into the New Testament, lay behind, of course, Luke, who wrote his gospel in the first place and wanted to give an ordered account of the life of Jesus for the sake of anyone who would read it and might take it to heart themselves.